Very good evening to all of you once again. I'm ever so thankful to have you all join us. Welcome back. We left off in 2 Kings 5 last time with the healing of Naaman the Syrian and whom had leprosy. We pick up now in verse 1. And the sons of the prophets said unto Elisha, Behold now, the place where we dwell with thee is too strait for us. Meaning it's too difficult of a place for all these prophets to dwell in. There was a school of prophets where Elisha dwelled, and he was pretty much their main teacher. These were called sons of the prophets, and they were actually kind of a revival was happening at this time with Elisha. But they say, Let us go, we pray thee, unto Jordan, and take thence every man a beam, and let us make us a place there where we may dwell. And he answered, Go ye. They're saying, let's go and build another place bigger so that all of us can dwell in it. And one said, Be content, I pray thee, and go with thy servants. And he answered, I will go. So Elisha went with them, and when they came to Jordan, they cut down wood. But as one was felling a beam, the axe head fell into the water, and he cried and said, Alas, master, for it was borrowed. So he's cutting down this tree. The axe head falls. It slides off while he's bringing it back. It's actually happened to me before. Slides off, goes behind him and into the water. But take note of how he is yelling out in a panic. He's very panicked. And he says, For it was borrowed. See, this would have been an iron axe head, but it would not have been very able to come by back then. The iron wasn't as prevalent as it is today. So much so that this young man actually had to go and borrow this axe. John Gill said of this, It grieved him to lose his axe, because he could do no more work, and the more because it was not his own, but he had borrowed it of his neighbor, and still more because, as it seems, he was poor, and not able to pay for it, which, being of an honest disposition, gave him distress. And the man of God, Elisha, said, Where fell it? And he showed him the place, and he cut down a stick, and cast it in thither, and the iron did swim. This was a fascinating little miracle that just happened right in front of them. And it's a very small matter that many people would probably overlook, but Jesus himself never overlooked small matters. Just like the marriage where the wine had ran out, he seen it necessary to perform a miracle then, just to provide the guests with more wine. Charles Ellicott said this, It indicated that iron could be made to float like wood by the sovereign power of Jehovah. The properties of material substances depend on his will for their fixity, and may be suspended or modified at his pleasure. The moral of this little story is that God helps in small personal troubles as well as in the great ones of larger scope. But even though this floating axe head, it is a miracle, and I'm certain that it strengthened the faith of everyone in whom witnessed it, these prophets in particular. But G. Campbell Morgan, he makes note of a far greater miracle that's happening in the whole nation at this time, even with these fellows. The chief value of the story lies in its revelation of the influence Elisha was exerting in the nation. The growth of the school of the prophets was most remarkable. And there's a little known substance to this story as well, that one can also see that Jesus himself had done in his day. Patterson and Austell said this, Elisha then caused the submerged axe head to surface and instructed the pupil to retrieve the axe. Of course, it was through the power of God. Thus, the servant would personally participate in the miracle. Remember how Jesus is out walking on water and Peter is yelling at him and he says, You come out too. Jesus, one of the most wonderful things about this revelation that God has opened up to us in the Bible about our future is how we are going to be let in on all of this heavenly glory. We inherit all things. That's one of those mind tornadoes. It takes you up into a heavenly bliss. There's no greater thought. Therefore said he, Take it up to thee, and he put out his hand and took it. Then the king of Syria warred against Israel, and took counsel with his servants, saying, In such and such a place shall be my camp. And the men of God sent unto the king of Israel, saying, Beware that thou pass not such a place, for thither the Syrians are come down. If you'll remember back in Elijah's day, the prophet and the king were not on good terms. And though it was a rocky relationship between Jehoram and Elisha, we see right here how Elisha is actually informing the king and telling him, don't go to where these Syrians are set up for an ambush, because that's what the prior verse meant. The Syrians were trying to ambush Israel. And the king of Israel sent to the place which the man of God told him and warned him of, and saved himself there not once nor twice, meaning this happened on several occasions. Matthew Henry had a very good point on the king of Israel taking this advice from Elisha at this time. The king of Israel regarded the warnings Elisha gave him of danger from the Syrians, but would not heed the warnings of danger from his sins. Such warnings are little heeded by most. They would save themselves from death, but will not from hell. Such is the non-believing world. They have such a narrow view, such a short-sighted view of things, very unconcerned with eternity, whenever it's a step away. Anyway, therefore the heart of the king of Syria was sore troubled for this thing, and he called his servants and said unto them, Will ye not show me which of us is for the king of Israel? He thinks that he has a spy in his midst. He doesn't know anything about Elisha. And one of his servants said, None, my lord, O king, but Elisha the prophet that is in Israel telleth the king of Israel the words that thou speakest in thy bedchamber. And the king said, Go and spy where he is, that I may send and fetch him. And it was told him, saying, Behold, he is in Dothan. As you'll see right here, Dothan is just a few miles above the capital of Samaria and Israel. Therefore sent he thither horses and chariots and a great host, and they came by night and compassed the city about. These would have been raiders, not the main army, but just raiders. And when the servant of the man of God was risen early, and gone forth, behold, a host compassed the city both with horses and chariots. And his servant said unto Elisha, Alas, my master, how shall we do? He's saying, What shall we do? And Elisha answered, Fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them. Jesus, he all the time said, Fear not, all the time. Here's just one of the instances. Matthew 10, And fear not, Jesus says, them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Many people believe that the soul can't be destroyed. You can't get any plainer than this. Jesus says, Fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Paul the Apostle said in 2 Corinthians 10:4, For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. We walk by faith, not by sight. They're seeing this army, the Syrian army, and terror comes upon the servant of God and the servant of Elisha. Comes upon this young man. And Elisha says, Don't worry. All will be well. As the psalmist said, I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about. Years before this, whenever Elijah was taken up in the whirlwind, right in front of Elisha actually got to see into the spirit realm where this flaming chariot parted both of them so that the whirlwind could take Elijah up. And Elisha even yells out upon seeing Elijah taken up. He says, my father, the horses, the chariots of Israel. He makes specific. So this was ingrained into his mind, these mighty, spiritual, supernatural armies that God has. And he remembers that at this instance and says, And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. You see, he only seen one in the days of Elijah. Now in the days of Elisha, there's an army. And remember how Jesus says that he can call on legions of angels to come and fight for him. I'm telling you, Elisha is the perfect picture of a type of Christ in the Old Testament. Charles Ellicott said, "It is a fine thought," says Phineas, "that on this occasion the veil of earthly existence was lifted for a moment for one child of man, so as to allow him a clear glimpse of the sovereignty of Providence." But one must ask themselves, so the armies of heaven look like chariots and horses of fire? I don't believe so. I believe that this was a definite army from heaven. But I agree with what the Cambridge commentary said about this. It is not necessary that we suppose the vision to have been of literal horses and chariots. The heavenly host, pay attention, the heavenly host was seen encamped about God's servant in such wise as to disperse all fear. I believe that if these angels would have shown up the way that they normally would have, they would have terrified. Even Elisha would have been terrified. But seeing something familiar to them would have relaxed them, especially knowing that they were on their side. And when they came down to him, Elisha prayed unto the Lord and said, "Smite this people, I pray thee, with blindness." And he smote them with blindness, according to the word of Elisha. I believe that it's obvious. Many people will read about these flaming chariots coming down these hills and mountains all around Elisha's fort right there. They'll read about that, but then they do not really get on to the next verse. This is what the army actually did to the Syrians. This is what this heavenly host actually did. They came down and blinded them for Elisha. If you'll remember how Elijah, whenever the captain and the 50s came before him those 3 times, 2 of the 3 times he called for fire to come down and to destroy them. All that Elisha, though, being a type of Christ, and not like Elijah, but he's a type of Christ. Elijah was like a type of John Baptist, and he shows mercy. This is grace coming from Elisha. Much, much grace. In the time of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, he is showing grace and exhibiting what Christ would later do on a far greater level. And Elisha said unto them, "This is not the way, neither is this the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom ye seek." But he led them to Samaria. And it came to pass, when they were come into Samaria, that Elisha said, "Lord, open their eyes of these men, that they may see." And the Lord opened their eyes, and they saw, and behold, they were in the midst of Samaria. And the king of Israel said unto Elisha, when he saw them, "My father, shall I smite them? Shall I smite them?" And Elisha answered, "Thou shalt not smite them. Wouldest thou smite those whom thou hast taken captive with thy sword and with thy bow? Set bread and water before them, that they may eat and drink, and go to their master." And he prepared great provision for them, and when they had eaten and drunk, he sent them away, and they went to their masters. So the bands of Syria came no more into the land of Israel. The bands are raiders, not the main army. And it came to pass after this that Benhadad king of Syria gathered all his host, and went up and besieged Samaria. So even though the raiders have made a vow to never go back and attack Israel, the king Benhadad actually does gather up his army. And there was a great famine in Samaria, and behold, they besieged it until an ass's head was sold for 80 pieces of silver, and the 4th part of a cab of dove's dung for 5 pieces of silver. They actually got so desperate that they not only ate the ass or the donkey, but they even sold its head. Things that they would not typically eat ever. They would suddenly start selling like dove's dung. They would start selling for very high prices. These prices would have been like 5 pieces of silver. That would have been about a month's worth of wages for just a little bit of dove's dung. And this is not the first time that this has happened. John Trapp mentions this. When Hannibal besieged Castellane, 1 mouse was sold for 200 pence. Puddings made of dog's guts were dear bought at the siege of Scodra. Now we're going to hear about how devastating that these besiegements would be. This was often the way that they would have warfare. If an army like Syria was facing a city with high walls like that of Samaria, the capital of Israel, if they were facing such high walls, then they would just settle outside and block from any trade going in or out, any goods going in or out, hoping to win the siege through starvation of the people inside. So Israel is being starved, and as the king of Israel was passing by upon the wall, there cried a woman unto him, saying, Help, my lord, O king. And he said, If the Lord do not help thee, whence shall I help thee? Out of the barn floor, or out of the winepress? And the king said unto her, What aileth thee? And she answered, This woman said unto me, Give thy son, that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow. So we boiled my son, and did eat him. And I said unto her on the next day, Give thy son, that we may eat him. And she hath hid her son. This was one of the promises or curses upon a nation in which so long rebelled against God. This actually shows how long that Israel had been rebelling against God. This is one of those last case scenarios. And God promised it unto a nation which kept rebelling against him. And they've been rebelling against God for well over 100 years at this point, Israel. But God says in Deuteronomy 28, he promises that he'll bring a nation to Israel if they disobey, and that they would besiege the city, just like the Syrians are doing right here. God already prophesied this 500 years before. And he says in it, when they come and besiege the city, And thou shalt eat the fruit of thine own body, the flesh of thy sons and of thy daughters, which the Lord thy God hath given thee, in the siege and in the straitness wherewith thine enemies shall distress thee. The tender and delicate woman among you, which would not adventure to set the sole of her foot upon the ground for delicateness and tenderness, her eye shall be evil toward the husband of her bosom, and toward her son, and toward her daughter. A lot of people wonder about a zombie apocalypse. You let people starve like this in a famine like this, which is promised in these days to be such a severe famine. It talks about how much food will cost and how it's like 6 months' wage for just some bread. But it will be like this. A lot of people, they talk about zombies. People will turn into zombies. So the king, Jehoram, is so distressed by this that he doesn't even answer the woman. He just hears that she's looking for the woman's son that she has hidden after already eating her own son. He just hears about this and just goes into a despair. And it came to pass when the king heard the words of the woman that he rent his clothes, and he passed by upon the wall, and the people looked, and behold, he had sackcloth within upon his flesh. Then he said, God do so, and more also to me, if the head of Elisha the son of Shaphat shall stand on him this day. So he wants to actually kill Elisha for this, instead of blaming his false golden calves that Jeroboam had built. Instead of blaming him and the sins of the nation, go and kill the only man in whom is right with God. But Elisha sat in his house, and the elders sat with him. And the king sent a man from before him. But before the messenger came to him, he said to the elders, Elisha speaking to the elders, See ye how this son of a murderer hath sent to take away mine head? Look, when the messenger cometh, shut the door, and hold him fast at the door. Is not the sound of his master's feet behind him? And while he yet talked with them, behold, the messenger came down unto them, and he said, Behold, this evil is of the Lord. What should I wait for the Lord any longer? Then Elisha said, Hear ye the word of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord, Tomorrow about this time shall a measure of fine flour be sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel in the gate of Samaria. Now this would have been quite the prophecy, because Elisha saying, You're going to go from nothing and inflation all over the place to this time tomorrow, you'll have so much in abundance that everything will be like a dollar. Then the Lord, on whose hand the king leaned, answered the man of God and said, Behold, if the Lord would make windows in heaven, might this thing be? And he said, Behold, thou shalt see it with thine eyes, but shalt not eat thereof. Because he doubts the prophecy, this servant of the king. Elisha, he says, yeah, you'll see this, but you'll not eat of it. Charles Spurgeon spoke about this unbelieving servant of the king. Unbelievers do not really enjoy the things of this life. The mass of them find that wealth does not yield them satisfaction. Their outward riches cannot conceal their inner poverty. They have everything except contentment. And there were 4 leprous men at the entering in of the gate, and they said one to another, Why sit we here until we die? At the entering in of the gate, this would have been away from the population, the people. These are the rejects of society because of their leprosy. And how often such people are looked down on. The poor and afflicted. Charles Spurgeon also said this, If you were to take out of the scriptures all the stories that have to do with poor, afflicted men and women, what a very small book the Bible would become. So the lepers began to speak one unto another, If we say we will enter into the city, then the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit still here, we die also. Now therefore come, and let us fall unto the host of the Syrians. If they save us alive, we shall live, and if they kill us, we shall but die. They know that if any reprieve of food just so miraculously happens to make its way inside of the city, that they'll be the very last ones to partake anyway. This is certain death for these poor men. So they simply just decide to, let's go into the Syrians. If they kill us, they kill us. We're going to die anyway. They're just taking a huge chance. But they might feed us, is what they're thinking. And they rose up in the twilight to go unto the camp of the Syrians. And when they were come to the uttermost part of the camp of Syria, behold, there was no man there. For the Lord had made the host of the Syrians to hear a noise of chariots, and a noise of horses, even the noise of a great host. And they said one to another, Lo, the king of Israel hath hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to come upon us. Obviously, I believe that it was probably the same chariots and horses that Elisha had seen, but the Lord, where he opened the eyes of Elisha and his servant, now he's opening the ears of these Syrians so that they can hear this mass host of, I bet it was very, very loud. This is heavenly chariots. This is very loud. Wherefore they arose and fled in the twilight, and left their tents and their horses and their asses, even the camp as it was, and fled for their life. So terrified, they didn't even want to face this army that they perceived was coming. It was just as frightening. And when these lepers came to the uttermost part of the camp, they went into one tent and did eat and drink, and carried thence silver and gold and raiment, and went and hid it, and came again and entered into another tent, and carried thence also, and went and hid it. Notice how it's these poor lepers that are getting to partake first of the spoils from God. Jesus says, He that is first shall be last, and he that is last shall be first. Then they said one to another, We do not well. This day is a day of good tidings, and we hold our peace. If we tarry till the morning light, some mischief will come upon us. Now therefore come, that we may go and tell the king's household. So after a few minutes or an hour or whatever of enjoying themselves in the Syrian camp on their food and storing away their riches, Albert Barnes has good comment on this, because now they're wanting to go back and tell the people. The lepers began to think that if they kept this important matter secret during the whole night for their own private advantage, when the morning came, they would be found out, accused, and punished. So they came and called unto the porter of the city, and they told them, saying, We came to the camp of the Syrians, and behold, there was no man there, neither voice of man, but horses tied and asses tied in the tents as they were. That's incredible. They even left their horses The Syrians did. They just took off. They didn't even have time in their fear to even stop and get on one of their horses and just take off. And he called the porters, and they towed it to the king's house within. And the king arose in the night and said unto his servants, I will now show you what the Syrians have done to us. They know that we be hungry, therefore are they gone out of the camp to hide themselves in the field, saying, When they come out of the city, we shall catch them alive and get them into the city. The king believes that it's all a trick by the Syrians. He says, well, let's test it first. Let's not just all run on out there and grab what they've got. They might be tricking us. And one of his servants answered and said, let some take, I pray thee, 5 of the horses that remain, which are left in the city. Behold, they are as all the multitude of Israel that are left in it. Behold, I say, they are even as all the multitude of the Israelites that are consumed. And let us send and see. They took therefore 2 chariot horses, and the king sent after the host of the Syrians, saying, Go and see. And they went after them unto Jordan, and lo, all the way was full of garments and vessels which the Syrians had cast away in their haste. And the messengers returned and told the king. So they had to run several miles, most of them on foot, presumably. And the Syrians, so terrified are they that they are actually throwing down their clothes and their garments and anything that might weigh them down. And the people went out and spoiled the tents of the Syrians. So a measure of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. And the king appointed the Lord on whose hand he leaned to have charge of the gate, the one that doubted Elisha's prophecy. And the people trode upon him in the gate, and he died, as the man of God had said, who spake when the king came down to him. They actually ran over him. You can see this today on Black Friday. People at Walmart, people die because they get trampled on. This also shows how desperate that the city was. They were near death. But I believe our motives today are far worse than what they had. They were facing death. Today it's just greed. And it came to pass, as the man of God had spoken to the king, saying, 2 measures of barley for a shekel, and a measure of fine flour for a shekel, shall be tomorrow about this time in the gate of Samaria. And that Lord answered the man of God, and said, Now behold, if the Lord should make windows in heaven, might such a thing be? And he said, Behold, thou shalt see it with thine eyes, but shalt not eat thereof. And he did not. That was the prophecy from the beginning, and he didn't partake. And so it fell out unto him, for the people trode upon him in the gate, and he died. Matthew Henry has a very foreboding comment that we're going to end this study on. He says, Learn how deeply God resents distrust of his power, providence, and promise, how uncertain life is, and the enjoyments of it, how certain God's threatenings are, and how sure to come on the guilty. I totally agree with it. That is the study for today. We will pick up here in a few days, Lord willing, in chapter 8. We're moving right along through 2 Kings. God, a peace be with you. Amen.